Alright, we're here to talk about time travel, and specifically aspects of it as depicted in Avengers Endgame. Now, first thing I want to say is this. The primary function of time travel in any science fiction is storytelling, okay? So the science aspect of it is a moot point, is the secondary aspect. It's a device used to further the story, and if you've gone down a dead end or you reach somewhere that you can't fix, then you can introduce it consistently with the storytelling to say we're going to go back and we're going to do this. In terms of the science of time travel, it's such a vague area that anything is possible, any form of time travel really is extremely implausible as we understand physics at the moment. So there's no point, you could, and people do, you can sit it for hours picking holes in the way any piece of science fiction treats time travel, and that's all very entertaining. It's better in the pub than sitting here in the kitchen on your own, so I'm not going to do it. But I just want to pick Endgame up on one thing. Now, they sort of slag off the use of time travel in Back to the Future. Fair enough. Terminator, yeah, okay. Although there's aspects of Terminator which are Terminator 2, in fact. The Terminator itself is a bit more consistent, but we'll talk about that in a second. Hot Tub Time Machine, I haven't seen it, so I can't comment. The one thing I want to object to, though, and to come in defence of, is the use of time travel in Bill and Ted. Because they lump Bill and Ted in with all these other things, and actually the treatment of time travel in Bill and Ted is extremely consistent and extremely plausible. It could work. Essentially, Bill and Ted's use of time travel is different from all those other ones. Back to the Future stuff is nonsense. How on earth would, how is this, the photo fades, the more things go wrong, the more the photo fades. How is that happening? By what physical mechanism is that happening? It's just nonsense. So the idea that the changing the past dynamically changes your own future, that doesn't hold water. There's no mechanism, known or unknown, that could possibly do that, is there? But Bill and Ted essentially, as far as I remember, and I should have watched the movies again, and haven't because I can't be bothered. But as far as I remember, Bill and Ted's treatment of how time travel works is entirely linear. It follows basically how Douglas Adams describes time travel. In other words, that if you travel back to the past, whatever you do is in the past and therefore has already happened and therefore can't change your present. Right? In other words, the present from which you travel back to the past. So, for instance, the old baby Hitler thing that Rhodey essentially, baby Thanos, baby Hitler, thing that Rhodey raises in Endgame. In the Douglas Adams model, if you go back in time to kill Hitler, whatever you did already happened and did lead to another event in your past, which is Hitler coming to power. So obviously whatever you did to kill Hitler, whatever you thought was killing Hitler, actually led to Hitler coming to power. So maybe you go back in time, you find what you think is baby Hitler, you kill baby Hitler, and then actually what happens is Mr. and Mrs. Schicklgruber adopt another baby, and that baby turns out to be the actual Adolf Hitler. So what you actually did facilitated the rise of Hitler, even though you were trying to stop it. There's nothing you can do. Whatever you did actually has already happened. So whatever it is that you think you're doing, it's not going to change your present and your other events in your past. You can't change the past. It's already happened. Okay, so that's the linear version of time travel. It's entirely consistent. So in Bill and Ted, that's essentially what we've got. There is a problem with this, and it's a problem of the storytelling and of essentially of philosophy, not of physics. It's entirely plausible in terms of, if we accept that time travel to the past is possible in terms of the physics, then there's nothing inconsistent in terms of physics about this linear Douglas Adams model of time travel. So in Bill and Ted, Rufus travels back from the future to try and save Bill and Ted's history exam, isn't it? So that wild stallions can become the guiding force of their civilization. Now, because the treatment of time travel is linear, Rufus knows that he succeeds, all right? This is called the inevitability problem. But that's a problem of philosophy and in science fiction of storytelling, of jeopardy and stakes, not a problem of physics. So you remember there's a bit in Bill and Ted where they need to have Ted's father's keys, don't they? And they say, well, we haven't got time. We've only got time to do that. And they say, well, we can make time because we can do it in the future, and then we can go back in time, steal his keys, and hide them behind this sign. They look behind the sign, and there they are. So that's a linear. They haven't changed. They haven't used time travel to the past to change anything, right? In their past, they already knew that happened, and it leads to the events in the future. Rufus knows, coming back from the far future as far as present Bill and Ted are concerned. Rufus comes back, and because Rufus has even done this, right? Because in Rufus's present, while Stallion are this great cultural force, he knows that he succeeds. All right. So there's no real jeopardy in what he's doing. Why on earth is Rufus wound up about this at all? Well, you could say actually dramatically he needs to be to convince Bill and Ted in the past of the need to pass the history exam. They need to be motivated, which clearly they aren't. So it's a motivating factor which he needs to use. So this is entirely consistent. The inevitability problem is that of free will. So it's a problem of human philosophy. If whatever you do when you travel back to the past can have no effect other on the future, in other words, the more recent past as far as your future self is, then where's free will? You don't have a choice. That's a question of philosophy. It's a question of what free will means, and it's also a question of how we think about time. Now, the question of time, in terms of physics, is a very interesting one. It's far more interesting, in fact, than time travel. Time travel is a science fiction thing, but look, there's loads of physicists who make a lot of money and fame from talking about time travel and how it could be possible in terms of physics. There are far more physicists who will basically say it's not possible. Time travel isn't possible. But you can get a long way. You can get on TV as a professional physicist by saying, "Oh, this is how time travel could work." I mean, the same with the multiverse thing. Really, parallel universes. It could be possible. There's elements of quantum physics that suggest that it could be possible. But really, if you ask what physicists deep down suspect is the truth, then most of them will say it's not really necessary. They would rather other models. Their instinct is towards other models that don't require this huge plethora of almost infinite possibilities at every single tiny interaction, which just it's just so inefficient that isn't. It's not that it's not possible, it just isn't our experience of how nature works, of how the universe works at a fundamental level. It doesn't just branch off into squillions and squillions of things. It generally is quite efficient, and it sort of narrows things down to possibilities. So anyway, but if you do talk to physicists off the record about what they think about time, a large proportion of them suspect that time is not a fundamental quantity of the universe in the way that space is. In other words, that there's some aspect of time which is subjective, it's something to do with how we process the universe, so that it's subjective to us humans, and not a fundamental quantity. It's something to do with how we interpret it, and that if you then follow that through, it tends to explain or begins to explain why we find, for instance, quantum mechanics, subatomic physics, so counterintuitive and so weird, because as far as one way of interpreting quantum mechanics is that subatomic particles don't experience time. So time is something that we impose on them, and as soon as we impose time on them, then suddenly things get weird. But the weirdness comes from our insisting on imposing time on particles that simply don't experience it. Anyway, Bill and Ted. So Endgame is very unfair on Bill and Ted in that Bill and Ted is almost, pretty much in terms of physics and physics is kind of made up, but certainly the philosophical treatment of time travel is entirely consistent and fairly watertight, and well thought through, much better thought through than the treatment of time travel in Endgame. Now, I'm not going to pick holes in this, but I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things. Firstly, Professor Hulk, when Rhodey raises these objections, Professor Hulk says that that's not how it works, but he deliberately kind of seems to rush through it so that we don't really have time to process what he's saying. That, for me, is a deliberate piece of script writing in that they don't want us to think about it too closely. So I couldn't work out whether he was describing a linear model of time, which, when we come to the Tilda Swinton scene later, seems to be what he was describing, seems to be his established understanding. But there also seems to be a thing where he's saying, that you can branch off into timelines and you just change the timeline or something. And from what the Russos have been saying post-Endgame interviews, they seem to be talking about branches in the timeline. However, when Professor Hulk comes to meet... Sorry, there are huge spoilers for Endgame in this. I didn't say that, did I? I'll put it in the title. Huge spoilers for Endgame. If you've not seen it, sorry, a bit late. You've had plenty of time. Come on, get on with it. It's good. You'll like it. So, Tilda Swinton explains that, she goes, this is your linear timeline, and then she said the Infinity Stones, I like this is plausible, and it makes the Infinity Stones more interesting. She says the Infinity Stones, one of their function is to maintain the timeline. That also, excuse me, explains this stuff that Doctor Strange talks about a lot as well, that his job, the Sorcerer's job, is to protect the nature of your reality, or to protect your reality. That makes a huge amount of sense, doesn't it? That these 6 Infinity Stones need to remain in their universe. That's what keeps this linear model of time and stops it branching off. That's potentially interesting. But then the problem is that at other points in the movie, then, there do seem to be branches off of this timeline, even though the 6 Infinity Stones are present. So, for instance, Loki stealing the Tesseract, that seems to be heading off into another timeline. 2014 Thanos heading off into 2023 and dying. So presumably 2014 is then left without a Thanos, so that's another timeline. And then the whole Captain America thing. I'm going to come back to the Captain America thing in a future video. But it's potentially explicable. You could say, okay, for instance, when Loki steals the Tesseract, perhaps Professor Hulk has already gone off with the Time Stone back to the future. So the Time Stone is missing, so there's a little window there where all 6 Infinity Stones do not exist in that universe, and so branching is possible. That could be interesting. What that suggests is that Captain America, in his end-of-movie mission, hasn't quite replaced them at exactly the right point. And you'd have to say, if that's happening, then every time they get a Time Stone, somewhere in the shadows, maybe this is, and we just don't see him, but somewhere in the shadows, there should be future Captain America ready to replace the stone as soon as they get it. So, in other words, that scene where Tilda Swinton hands over the Time Stone and Bruce Banner zaps out. I don't think we see him zap out, do we? But, she should immediately reappear. I mean, perhaps that's what happens in 2014 with Thanos, is that Rhodey zaps out. No, he's got the Power Stone, and that doesn't make any sense. So it's not... All I'm saying is this. I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to pick holes in it, except I am going to talk about the Captain America thing in a future video. But the point is this. It's a kind of loose, story-based treatment of time travel. The point of time travel in Avengers Endgame is to make the story, to raise the stakes, to make the real deaths, not the snap deaths, as genuine, to drive home. They do this really, really well. The Black Widow death especially, you kind of go, okay, she's not coming back. And then it needs to establish that when people die, when we see people die in this movie, they're actually dying. So it really makes it emotionally, raises the emotional temperature and the stakes. But it's not a particularly... For a movie that several times slags off other movies for their treatment of time travel, it's not a particularly consistent treatment of time travel at all. And in particular, it's nowhere near as consistent as the treatment of time travel in Bill and Ted, and that's the point I was trying to make. So, If you want to read more, the interesting part of all this is if you want to read more, is this business about the fundamental nature of time. And if you do want to read more, then leave a comment, and I will point you in the direction of a couple of really interesting books on the subject. Not going to bore you with the fine detail of it right here, right now. Okay, good. That's what I wanted to say. Bill and Ted, yay. To pick up on a couple of things that I said in my last video, interesting, some of these things didn't really come to fruition, did they? Why wasn't Tom Hiddleston at the premiere? Well, he was in the movie, and he's going to get his own spin-off. We assume that's when he steals a Tesseract and off he goes. That's a new timeline for Loki. So, could have shown up, couldn't he? A lot of people with smaller roles did show up. Misdirection in the trailers, there wasn't much. In fact, there were it was kind of a double bluff, wasn't it? There was, we saw Thor eating and drinking beer in the trailers, and there we are. So actually, we should have probably paid more attention. Could we have paid more attention to the trailers? It was all there. There was very little. There was, Fat Thor was CGI'd out, but apart from that, there was a lot more in there. Than perhaps we could have expected. It was kind of half right about the Soul Stone, but this business about Thanos knowing Tony Stark's soul, what is all that about? I guess that's just because he has the Soul Stone. There wasn't any particular connection between Tony and the Soul Stone. It's just that, Thanos in Infinity War seems to know a lot about everyone he used. Maybe he used the Soul Stone to work out who Tony was. I don't know. Didn't seem to make a point of it. And I didn't really understand, I still don't really understand that thing that Doctor Strange says when he first meets Thanos. You're more of a Thanos. More of a Thanos than who? I don't know. But maybe that's to do with the nature of what he went through to see all those possible futures. Anyway, those have answered those if you're interested. I'm going to do another video, not quite now, I've got to go to work, but about this Captain America going back in time business, because there's some interesting points to it. People have picked holes in it and raised points about it already, but there's a few that people haven't made. But anyway, to summarise, Bill and Ted, awesome.